My name is Brianna Kilgore, and I'm here to inform you on how deaf people communicate with others. What would your world be like if you woke up one morning and you couldn't hear the fire alarm, the doorbell ringing, your phone ringing, or you go outside and you see people all around you are communicating with one another, but you cannot hear or make out what they're saying? What if the world around you was completely silent? How does your communication begin when this is your starting point? Most people view deaf people as someone who lacks communication and cannot communicate at all. Yet that's not the case. Corey Ford, author of Communication Matters, states, "Communication is the process by which we use signs, symbols, and behaviors to exchange information and create meaning." Being deaf doesn't mean you lack communication. Being deaf just means you have a different way of communicating with others. Being deaf makes communication a much more difficult mountain to climb, and people of the deaf community have to climb this mountain every day to cross that language barrier. Language is one of the most critical aspects of most cultures, and one which sets deafness aside from other defects such as blindness, physical disability, or illness. HandsandVoices.org in 2013 states, "American Sign Language was not even recognized as a language until the 1960s. Thomas Hopkins Galloway opened the very first permanent school for deaf children in Hartford, Connecticut. This is where he taught the children by using just his hands. Although American Sign Language was eventually recognized as a language, it was once very highly frowned upon. Some saw American Sign Language as a way of preventing people of the deaf community from learning to speak and lip read. In the late 1860s, oral schools started to open up for the deaf children. They did not teach any kind of signing at these oral schools for the deaf children. All signing was banned and was not allowed to be used as any form of communication. They began speech training for the deaf children here. They had them stand in mirrors for hours talking and learning how to lip read. Schools for the deaf were the first place where the people of the deaf community could come together. This is where they shared their own language and culture. Eventually, signing made its comeback. In the deaf community, an American Sign Language is the language used to communicate by the deaf community throughout the United States and America. Thomas K. Holcomb states, in the introduction to American Deaf Culture, that the concept of culture reframed for us the idea of being deaf and allowed us to explore deaf people's long tradition of language and history as a way of understanding their lives. We a lot of times still tend to look at signing as something less than a real language, and nothing more than just a system of hand gestures. American Sign Language is the way people of the deaf community can communicate with one another by using just their hands. This is the American Sign Language alphabet, and this shows you how people of the deaf community can use their hands to make out letters and numbers, and this is how they spell words and communicate with others. When signing, not only do people use their hands to communicate, but they use their facial expressions and body language to communicate as well. Sharing your feelings and emotions is easy when signing, because American Sign Language is naturally just so expressive. Most deaf people in America are bilingual. They use both American Sign Language and English. This is because they live and interact among both deaf and hearing people. Even though some English is used on a daily basis by most deaf Americans, American Sign Language is the most accessible language for deaf people. Over the years, as American Sign Language continues to change and evolve, it is still the main way people communicate with one another in the deaf community. Communication plays a major role in our lives, and we deal with it every day. Just because someone communicates differently than you doesn't mean it's any lesser form of communication. American Sign Language used to be seen as less than a language and not even a language at all at one point in time. Deaf people have fought long and hard to ensure that deaf children have access to the most powerful solutions for communication and effective living. It used to be very hard for people of the deaf community. People saw them differently, and they just didn't want to communicate with them at all because they didn't think there was any way that you could ever communicate with someone who was deaf. Now today, signing is very widely accepted throughout the United States, and it's a very common part of communication in our everyday world. Communication was and can still be very difficult for people in the deaf community.